So, doing bad things for the right reason. Ryan Nolette is going to be telling us a little bit about the AWS vulnerability management or vulnerability disclosure process. But first, we want to thank our sponsors again. Without our sponsors, we don't have a live stream, we don't have a hotel, we don't have speakers coming in. So Inviticus Incident Response is specialized in responding to cloud incidents across all major cloud providers. Ooh, they're multi-cloud. AWS, Azure, GCP, as well as SaaS platforms like M365 and Google Workspace. While not responding to incidents, Inviticus will help organizations with their cloud security assessments to prevent and prepare for incidents. So thank you, Inviticus. Ryan, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. There we go. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm very excited and honored to be here to speak to you today about a subject near and dear to my heart, which is vulnerability disclosure. And from my perspective, with cloud services really forming the backbone of the digital infrastructure these days, it's paramount that we ensure that potential issues are disclosed responsibly. And I've had a lot of coffee today, so we can speed run this like Mario, because I got 20 minutes to go through some stuff. So what I want you to know about this presentation is this is kind of a greatest hits. Since I work on the vendor side of VDP, a lot of people think it's kind of a black box. I get a ton of questions. So today we're going to go through some of the most common questions that we get at AWS for VDP. So let's jump on into it. No, that's the laser button. All right, so quick intro. I'm Ryan. I am the tech lead for the AWS Security Outreach team. We're responsible for coordinated vulnerability disclosure for all of AWS, every service, every open source package. If AWS owns it, we are responsible for doing the CVD for it. While I've received a bunch of accolades, nobody really cares. They're not relevant today. So if you want to add me, I'm on the Cloud Security Forum and I'm on LinkedIn. And yes, that is a picture of me. I love this clicker. All right. So the first three things that we get all the time and I'm not going to deep dive, I'm just going to jump on them real quick. So how does scalability and elasticity of the cloud environments change the way that I approach assessing risk? Well, I find that because cloud services are designed to be scalable dynamically, that the transient nature of the cloud resources have to be taken into account for the implications, right? We want to be able to see stuff, we want to be able to account for it. So that kind of leads to my motto whenever I'm doing any kind of blue teaming type security is visibility and accountability. If you cannot see it, you cannot account for it. And if you can't account for it, you can't do anything about it. So the real idea is to increase your visibility until you can have that accountability for who is doing what and when in your environment. The next thing is, should I pay more attention to third-party integrations and external dependencies? Yes, absolutely. All right, cloud environments often integrate with third-party services, and security teams have to assess these services and figure out what their security posture is for the integration. You have to be able to trust your vendors, and that makes things difficult. But I say read your documentation, follow best practices, and the world will be a happy place, right? Yeah, I see you. All right, and next up, lastly, why should security teams care about traditional vulnerabilities, right? We're in the cloud now. Old style security doesn't exist, right? Right? Well, the problem is that workloads exist on the cloud, and those workloads use traditional applications, so they're still vulnerable to things like cross-site scripting, SQL injection, all that fun stuff. And just because they're running in a workload in the cloud does not mean the cloud is vulnerable. And that's where we talk about things like the shared responsibility model and another fun topic. But the other common debate that I have is, what's the difference between CVD and responsible disclosure? You'll see while I'm up here, I'm using the term coordinated vulnerability disclosure, CVD. And the reason for that is because I personally want to put a heavy, heavy, heavy emphasis on the coordinated part, right? We can separate those two with scope and scale. So CVD is often used for vulnerabilities with wide-reaching impact. It requires coordination between multiple stakeholders, right? Whether this is vendors and customers, if we have to work with CERT or VINTs to have a wide-scale thing, it really depends on the scaling. But responsible disclosure is usually applied just to individual vulnerabilities. And the difference in these definitions really matter because as part of the CVD process, you have to define who does what, when, and why. Otherwise, you're going to have too many cooks in the kitchen, there's going to be a lot of arguments going on, and overall, people get sad. So in the context of coordinated vulnerability disclosure, the first role here, as we see, is security researchers. Those are those awesome people that find stuff. They like to go to the dark places on the internet, poke it with a stick, and see what crawls out, right? They are the trailblazers into the new technologies. But when they find stuff, they need to coordinate with the vendor and report it and make sure that the vendor understands the impact and potential exploitation scenarios of it. Because the vendor, which is the next responsibility, has to acknowledge and address the reported issue promptly, right? Nobody likes sending emails and being left on red, right? Communicating with the researchers about the impacted entities is going to help us scale, not scale, it's going to help us scope the scale of the actual issue. Right? The mitigation or fixing the reported issue is on the vendor as well. Even if it's not directly with the vendor, sometimes like an open source package that's partially owned, things like that are going to go through the vendor, and then notifying the affected customers. So for those of you who also work at vendors who have ever had a vulnerability occur and had to notify your customers, that's pretty interesting. Now imagine at scale. And also the main thing about doing the mitigations and fixes is about minimizing disruption to services and maintaining that operational integrity. All right, if you find an issue in like a core service, you can't just restart it, right? Because that's hundreds of millions of workloads going, tons of logs, and people depend on some of these logging services for audit. So we need to be very careful around that. And the last one is the affected parties. So customers, users, whoever it is that could be impacted by this, they are going to be focused more reactive, and they're going to focus on awareness and risk management. So the key aspect of the CVD process is that coordination between these parties and prioritizing, minimizing the risk posed by the issue to those end users. Right. At the beginning of it, the researcher and the vendor typically work in a pretty quiet partnership to discuss the initial discovery, the reproduction portion, all of that fun stuff, and then the vendor is going to be creating a patch. After that occurs, they're ready to work together to coordinate when they're going to disclose publicly. So how does AWS do their part? Wallet text, so much text. Well, you don't have to memorize these, but I want you to know that this is just a small portion of the questions that I have to answer for every single report that I get, right? We ask these questions a lot. What happens once AWS gets a vulnerability reported to it? Well, we need to prioritize it. We need to answer a bunch of these questions and a ton more, and how we're going to do that is through this workflow. So this is the super high level version of the AWS CVD workflow. And to break it down, it's kind of into three sections. We have reporting, mitigation, and disclosure. All right, we're going to start off with, once we get the report, we're going to ask, is this an AWS security concern, right? Is an AWS service, open source product, et cetera, impacted? The second thing is going to be, if the report is not an AWS security issue, well, what happens to it? Do we just go quiet, whatever? No, what ends up happening is if we find out we're not impacted by a security issue that's been reported, we are going to help the reporter find the point of contact at the correct place. And in some occasions, we are even going to offer to help submit on behalf of the researcher. particularly in cases that require a lot of coordination. So if something's going to involve Vince, if it's going to involve, 40, 50 companies, something like that, we will offer to be their coordination for it. Still, their name goes for the report. They get all the credit. We're there just to answer some emails and help people move it smoother along. And finally, we're going to be coordinating, after the reported issue, if it is a security concern, we'll confirm with the researcher that the report is valid. So that's one of the main steps that we've been implementing, is that we always acknowledge. Then we're going to begin the CVD process, where we confirm if there's customer impact. If there is, well, that's when we have to do the prioritization of, do we do immediate mitigation, or do we do a workaround, compensating control in order to mitigate the risk before we can do remediation? Do we have to contact the customers? Is that through email, through a personal health dashboard update, et cetera? And then finally, we coordinate with the researcher to do the disclosure on the messaging. So we like to try and launch the AWS side of the messaging at the same time, or roughly at the same time, as the researchers like to publish their blogs. So that way the users and customers can see both sides of the discussion. It's a pretty nice theory, but in practice, what does it look like? Well, luckily, we have someone talking later today that can tell you a whole bunch more about the process from the researcher side. But Nick gave us permission to talk about this one because it was a great example of a report and how to do coordinated vulnerability disclosure with a vendor. Each of these statements here are things that are going to allow us as the vendor to better prioritize and assess the report. So a couple things on here. Proof of concept, clear, reproducible steps. Nick submitted some great content. We went back and forth a little bit, and we got some scripts, and we were able to get a wonderful POC to test things. Another thing is the traffic light protocol of the information. Super important to know for the vendor. Who can we tell this information to internally? And for those of you who have not who are not very familiar with TLP, I do suggest looking it up. It is super common in the industry to use now, to put these traffic light protocols around your information sensitivity, and it makes things very easy for the vendor to figure out where it goes. Now, when you answer these questions in your submission, we can quickly and easily reproduce your report, find the appropriate stakeholders internally, and start to engage immediately. Right? Or in Jerry Maguire's words, help me help you, right? Help me help you, because in the end, I'll let you on the secret, I'm not as smart as most of you, right? I think that's a terribly kept secret, except a few of you, and you know who you are. So anyways, I bring this up because learning how to write to different audiences is an incredibly important skill, no matter what your job is, all right? And I can help you practice that, right? Writing those exec summaries, trying to paint me pictures, explain it to me like I'm 5. That is going to greatly help me. Give me those visual aids. Give me a POC with code snippets. Tell me what you could do with the technique if, I don't know, you were feeling hangry or something that day. Like, help me understand the actual impact that could happen from this finding. And in the end, if you explain it like I'm 5, I have a better chance of escalating the issue properly. And instead of needing to call in a subject matter expert to tell me whether or not the issue is more than just theoretically possible. All right, tell me all kinds of cool stuff about services, trying to break down how the CPU architecture or microarchitecture works, that's out of my league. But speaking of submissions that are difficult to work with, we get these kind of things. So then we never get any follow-up. The specifics of the submission have been slightly modified to protect the privacy of the sender, but I can tell you that they do have 52 grandparents who have died this year as of last count. So they send us all kinds of great stuff. But this makes me a sad panda because it's unapplicable actionable. I don't know what service is impacted. There's no contact information for follow-up to ask additional questions to. Sometimes people aren't responsive to follow-up questions, which could help us with the POC reproduction, like what version of Python did you run in your environment? Because it's breaking for us, but oh, okay, you're using 5 versions ago. Well, those calls are no longer implemented. Update your code and retest, those kinds of things. And lastly, try not to laugh, but don't threaten the staff. It's just not helpful, right? We are your advocate internally. Our entire job is to advocate for you and give you that seat at the table, right? We want to help. And speaking of helping, how do we help with embargoes? This gets asked to me all the time because embargo is a really cool word and defined differently by every human on Earth. So here we're going to say the primary objective of embargo for us is to strike that balance between keeping the public informed and giving an organization the necessary time to address and mitigate the issue, right? And the follow-up question to that is usually, but why can't I publish it now? Well, immediate disclosure can lead to exploitation by third parties, while indefinite secrecy doesn't really help anyone and leaves users at risk. So we have to strike that balance. And how do we calculate that? Well, we do it on severity-based timelines, right? The bigger the issue, the more resources you can kind of put behind it. Complexity of the fix. This goes back to having uptime, right? If you find something in like a real core service, we can't just turn it off and turn it back on again, right? So there's going to be a whole lot of difficulty behind that fix. The clear communications and coordination. The clearer you are when you do the reporting and responding to the questions, the easier and faster we can move forward with the process on our side and the shorter the embargo times required. I already kind of mentioned it, but impact of fix. Is it a breaking change? Right? Because if it's going to be a breaking change to fix it, not only do we have to do the actual fix, but we have to have mass communication campaigns. And as you can see at our scale, that's a lot of messages going out to a lot of people. So that requires coordination and goes into our timeline calculation. So what do we do when the embargo lifts? Well, we ensure that the coordinated disclosure includes as much detailed information as possible about the vulnerability, the fix, and particularly guidance for users. If there is user action required, we need to give them the guidance of what to do. And of course, after the embargo comes the disclosure part. Right? A good public disclosure, once again, prioritizes minimizing the risk to users. So the attributes of a good public disclosure are we are going to, from our side, emphasize the approach between the researchers, the vendors, and the stakeholders to address those issues before the public disclosure occurs, once again, to minimize risk to users. The clear communication and end user communication and education. So this goes into what we're going to do if it's a security advisory, if we're going to create new documentation, if we're going to write a bunch of emails to folks, personal health dashboard updates, how are we going to communicate that out? And in the end, we want to, once again, minimize that risk to the end user. So we all know public disclosure should be the last step in the process, but something that we didn't mention is the first step, which is reporting. So how do you report right now? So AWS has an email address. Everyone's kind of known about this. It's aws-security@amazon.com. This is basically just a mailbox on the internet. You can submit whatever you want to it. And with this comes a couple of SLAs, those commitments for response from AWS. So we have acknowledgement by a human within 24 hours, and we adhere to timely updates, monthly check-ins, and all of this is defined here at the AWS vulnerability reporting page. On here, we include information like our safe harbor. So we use Gold State Safe Harbor now. So you guys can search that up. It's also written there up on this site. Our disclosure policy. So what's within scope to submit to AWS? Our CNA scope, out of what you submit, what is available for CVEs, contact links to different folks. So if it's trust and safety or fraud, or if it's actually security of like the infrastructure, and then all of the SLAs so everyone can see them. And while this works just fine, we've heard a lot of your feedback, and we've expanded the program to improve that experience. So I'm super happy that I can tell you that after a few years today, starting about 4 minutes ago, you can now use the AWS public VDP on HackerOne. And this is going to include a lot of cool new information. So we're going to have additional transparency to the guidelines, the scope, the policy, all of that right on the page. Wrote it. We got it approved by everybody. It is up there. We really want to focus on more ways for researchers to be recognized for the hard work and contributions that they're doing to security. So to kind of dig into some of these things, these are some of the new program additions. So what's nice about this is now there's a web portal with a standardized submission form, right? We're trying to reduce ambiguity, right? What do we actually want to see in a report, all of that kind of stuff. Through this, you can add collaborators to your report now. It's easier to work with other researchers in the community and submit a single report with a group of folks. The ability to view your entire report history and the conversations you had. No more searching your inbox, no more trying to figure that stuff out. Publicly defined scopes of both the vulnerability reporting and on the vulnerability reporting page and the VDP policy page, so those will be in sync, so people will know and they can find the same information at both places. These scopes are really meant to make it easier and faster to report to the security concerns. And now as a CNA, which you guys might have seen the announcement for, AWS has publicly defined what's in scope and qualifies for CVE. So there should be a lot less questions about that in general. And then finally, the ability to submit feedback to AWS on every report. Was this a good experience? What could we do better? What's a friction point? And that is direct feedback to our team who is running this. And speaking of feedback that we received on the program, people have really asked for how we're going to do recognition. We added a whole bunch of new recognition to the program. So now we're able to have tiers in the program. There's now a public leaderboard for your experience and reputation. We're going to use the similar leadership board on HackerOne, but we're also going to have custom badges, one for every service, so that way you can prove and show off what you're an expert in. And with this, you can add those to your LinkedIn profiles, your resumes, wherever you want to put them. We're also doing researcher testimonials. So before there were things like thank you notes you could get on an AWS header, but now we can do public testimonials that'll be linked right to your researcher account. So that way you can show off all the different testimonials that you have received. And the last thing is something that a lot of you have been asking for, and that is nominations to the invite-only private bug bounty program. I know, everyone's really excited about that. I'll be honest, I was expecting more of a reaction, because this is the first time we've talked on stage about this ever. Woo! So if you want to check it out, go ahead here and go to our QR code. This will link you right to the page. You can create an account and start submitting now. And if there are any questions, we can take them.
All right. So there were a number of questions queued up in Slack. I'm sure there's a number of questions queued up in the room. At about 12:20, I think we're heading up to lunch. So if you go up the stairs or up one level in the elevator, you'll be able to find the lunchroom. Just kind of go towards the Scooby-Doo van, and you should see it from the lobby. All right, so with that, let me take the first question from Slack. So with regards to why don't you just ask it? It's your question. Okay, fair enough, fair enough. What happens if AWS disagrees with the severity impact of an issue with the researchers? Will AWS be happy with the researchers publicly posting the research that they've done, including the vulnerabilities after a suitable amount of time, such as 60, 90 days?
So first and foremost, reporting things through the VDP program, there is no contract, right? There's no NDA with it. So you guys can publish what you want when you want. There's never, ever been a restriction around that with VDP. AWS does not impact what you can and can't write. So what we will do is we will give a public statement. So something new that we have started is for every vulnerability report that gets submitted, when we do finish our triage and investigation portion of it, we start to create a public statement. So what is our position on the issue? And we will be issuing that to the submitter of the report so they can include it in their blog, and that'll give our opinion on it. If there's a disagreement, we obviously can have a longer discussion on it, but we are going to back up why we did a certain score with the reasons and quotes directly from the first guidance on CNA stuff.
All right. Do you want to? Oh, nobody on this side? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I have a question. Is there any process for in AWS when there is like supply chain attack happening through one of the services? Like it happened to us once. We discovered something RCE run in dependency using one S3 bucket, and like took us like 6 weeks discussing with the support from AWS to delete the bucket, given all the proofs. But is there any process like for this in AWS? Thanks.
Yeah, so it sounds like what you did, you submitted through your TAM, which is one of the acceptable processes, but as it was also an additional security concern, you can either escalate that through your TAM and say this is a security concern, or you can shoot us an email over at aws-security@amazon.com, and humans are going to read that. They are going to figure out the actual prioritization and risk of the thing, get you a response, and get things actioning. So yeah, if you're not getting the response you want, feel free at any point in time to reach out to our email address, because we are there to answer questions, give guidance, and actually, get things moving for you.
Okay, so from the Slack, so does the shiny new HackerOne VDP apply a bunch of restrictive terms of services, as many do on HackerOne? Often that includes restrictions on independently publishing information post-disclosure.
No.
There you go.
Simple and easily, yeah. This is not a restrictive program. It is a VDP, so it is meant for anybody to submit to. You don't need a certain level of reputation to submit. You don't need to have specific skill sets to submit. If it is within scope, which is defined on the VDP program policy page and on the asset page, you can submit for it.
Okay, I have a question. So we recently saw a specific vulnerability like the AWS Transit Gateway pairing, where you could accept the pairing without authorization, which is one of many you could classify into the cross-tenant vulnerabilities. And in the workflow you've shown, there was this communicate part at the end, or disclose, but there has been no disclosure around this. Are there, what's the criteria for when you will disclose and when there won't be any public disclosure from Amazon? Because we usually find the disclosure on Twitter or on a blog post.
Disclosure or statement?
Well, disclosure, basically, like vulnerability that affected all your clients with Transit Gateway, for instance.
So which party is doing the disclosure, the third external party, or AWS in that scenario?
I would expect AWS to do it because it affected all the clients. If you had Transit Gateway, you were technically vulnerable. But
okay, so our public disclosure statement. So for AWS, we have multiple kinds of external messaging that we'll do. Probably the most common that would go with that scenario would be a security bulletin, which is up on the AWS security bulletin page. page, and that usually defines things like what the impact was, if there's any customer impact, if so, what the guidance is to do remediation. All of those types of things will be available there. And if more specific action is required, we'll additionally do those like personal health dashboard, mass email campaigns, things like that. And even sometimes the AWS security blog will have a in-depth blog on how to do mitigation for it.
Can I add to that? Like, if there is something like that, where like a lot of people are feeling like we're missing a statement from AWS on this, like, what should we do?
Oh, so you're no longer going to feel that way because now it is SOP for us to create the public statement for your submissions. So if you submit to us, you are going to get a statement.
And those statements will be publicly for everyone, or
Those statements, the whoever submitted it can post it wherever they want.
And what if they don't post it? Is it going to be somewhere?
I can't make them post it. Could you imagine?